over to him. So I have just clicked the record button. For those folks who may be joining after this live session on October 23rd, 2018, this is a presentation by Chris Webb regarding, as you see on your screens now, building custom data connectors. So please take it away, Chris.
Thank you, Wes.
Yep.
Hi, everybody. It's always a problem doing one of these Skype presentations because you can never be sure whether anybody's actually there. But if I lose internet halfway through this, somebody Google for my phone number and give me a call, because otherwise I'll be speaking for an hour and nobody will be listening. But if you do have any questions, feel free to stop me and ask me halfway through. It makes it a little bit easier to talk when I know that there's somebody there listening. Anyway, first of all, let me introduce myself. My name is Chris. I'm a consultant and trainer. I'm based in the UK, but I work with customers all around the world. In fact, I was talking to one of my US customers last month, and he said, Chris, I hear you're coming to my city to do a user group presentation. And I said, am I? And he'd heard about this, but sadly, I was not actually attending in person, so I wasn't going to be able to claim the beer that he was offering me. But yeah, I live and breathe Power BI nowadays. I've been working with Microsoft BI for a good long time. But Power BI is where I'm at now, and yeah, I blog, so there are all of my links. Anyway, let's get on to the important stuff. What are we going to be talking about this evening? So, first of all, we will broadly summarize what custom connectors are. Then we will go through a couple of Power BI and not necessarily Power BI related prerequisites to understand, which are going to be relevant for learning about custom connectors. Then we will understand why it's going to be important to build custom connectors. And then finally, there will be some demos where we can see building custom connectors in action and some details about certain points of implementation. We are not going to be spending a long time looking at code, because I don't know, I find presentations where somebody just writes code on stage not all that interesting. But you know, this is a kind of development topic, so I think we are going to have to see some Visual Studio at some point. Okay, first of all, asking the obvious question: what are custom connectors? So custom connectors are a way of adding new data sources to Power BI. So if you go to Power BI and you click the Get Data button, you see obviously a list of 80 or 90 built-in data sources nowadays. With custom connectors, you can add to that list. They appear alongside all of the built-in data sources in Power BI Desktop when you're loading data into your data set. In fact, if we have a look now, and I open up Power BI Desktop, and I go to Get Data, and I click More, you will see down at the bottom of my list of data sources a couple of data sources that you may not have installed. So for example, this CData Excel and Excel Online, this is a third-party custom data connector that I've got installed. And there are a few here as well that I've built. This one here is one that I'll show you a bit later. So that's what custom connectors are. The next thing is, how do I build one? You're going to need Visual Studio. You're also going to need to install the Power Query SDK. So the Power Query SDK, once you've downloaded and installed it, will allow you to build custom connectors in the M language in either Visual Studio 2015 or 2017. You're probably also going to need some documentation. This is, well, the main source of documentation is on GitHub at the github.com Microsoft Data Connectors link that I've just shown you. Interestingly, that seems to be a lot of the useful information that's there seems to be migrating over to the new Microsoft documentation site. So I only saw this a couple of days ago, but if I find my browser window, come on, why not working? All right, we've got, for example, here on the documentation, there's a whole section on custom connector development with a lot of very interesting information there as well. So on docs.microsoft.com. Okay, so that's what custom connectors are. Let's start to understand how we go about building them. Before I get into the detail about custom connectors, there are a few other things to explain because there are a couple of prerequisites to understand about Power BI and related technologies that you'll need to understand before you can really understand how custom connectors work. First of all, and most importantly, custom connectors are developed in the M language. And what is M apart from another language that you've got to learn? So M is the language of Power Query, and Power Query is the technology that drives data loading in Power BI, in Excel, in Excel's 2016's Get and Transform, in the new data flows functionality that you may have heard about. Power Query is being implemented inside Microsoft Flow. Power Query is taking over the world. So Power Query is this technology for self-service ETL almost, and it's the technology that's built into Power BI and Excel. Everything you do in the Power Query editor in Power BI Desktop gets converted to M code, and you can view M code in Power BI Desktop, but if you want to write custom connectors, you're going to have to write M code in Visual Studio. We will see some M code in just a moment. Next prerequisite, probably the most obvious of the lot, ODBC. There is a lot that you can do with ODBC in Power BI. Power BI has got a built-in connector for ODBC. ODBC is just a standard way of connecting to relational databases and lots of other types of data source. Pretty much every data source out there somebody has built an ODBC provider for. It's very, very popular way of providing a kind of standard access for data sources. Something else that's similar and may need a little bit more explanation is OData. So OData I've heard described as ODBC for the web. And OData is an open standard. It's heavily promoted by Microsoft, but other vendors use it as well. And the way to think about OData is something like this. Everybody knows about web services. Web services are obviously very, very popular. The problem with web services, though, is that if you're going to use and consume web services, you have to be a developer. You've got to write some code because every web service is different. Now, that's fine if you're somebody that can write code, but if you're a Power BI user, you might not be able to write the code that calls the web service to get the data out that you need. In an ideal world, Power BI and tools like Power BI, for example, Excel, would be able to just connect to a web service, get the data out without you having to write any code. Now, OData is an attempt to try and make that a reality. So if your web service implements OData, then you will find that it exposes its endpoints and everything in a standard way. It almost exposes things a little bit like a relational database. And because it is a standard, your client tool like Power BI or indeed Excel doesn't need to know anything about the specifics of the web service in order to get data out of it. All it needs is just a single URL. You point Power BI at that URL and you can get data out. If you want to learn a bit more about OData, you can go to odata.org. I think we've just missed probably the worst pun that you would ever see anywhere on a website, as a guy having a REST. And OData implements a RESTful APIs. I don't know how people can get away with that. But if you go to odata.org, you'll see that there are all kinds of resources and documentation for learning about OData. There are also a couple of sample services, such as the trip pin service here. This is something that exposes some data about people and airlines and going on trips. If we go, for example, here, let's have a look at this. This is a URL which is going to give me some information about the people entity. I just pasted in here. This particular OData web service doesn't need any authentication. This is going to give me a table with a list of people in. If, for example, I go back here, if you take a look at this, this is going to take that list of people, that people entity, and filter it where first name equals Scott. So you can see it's a query language that we can all understand. And then here we've got some information about the user Scott Ketchum, whose first name is indeed Scott. So you can appreciate that it's a way of making any web service not only queryable, but queryable in a standard way, which then makes it very easy for tools like Power BI to get data out of it without any coding required. The next thing to talk about is query folding. So query folding is a fairly advanced concept in the world of Power Query, but it's very, very relevant for custom connectors. So query folding refers to the way that when you connect to a data source in Power BI using Power Query technology, and you get some data and you apply filters and transformations, it refers to the way that, where possible, Power Query will take all of the things that you defined in your query and do all of the hard work back in the data source. Let me give you an example of this. If I go to Power BI Desktop here and I connect to my local SQL Server instance, I'm in import mode, and I'm going to connect to the good old AdventureWorks DW database. I'm just going to connect to the dim date table. So let's open up the query editor. Come on, where are you? Here we go. So here's the dim date table. And if I select just a couple of columns from here and filter a couple of rows, you can see that I'm getting just a subset of data from that dim date table on SQL Server. Now, if you think about what would happen if this was a really large table, you can probably appreciate that the worst possible thing that the Power Query engine could do would be to connect to that table, read all of it, bring it down to my desktop, and do the filtering there. Because then it would not only be slow, it might bring my PC to its knees. So as a result, rather than doing that, it takes all of those steps, all of the things I'm doing in my query, and it tries to push the filters, the column selection, back to the data source. Now in this case, the data source is SQL Server, and that means the Power Query engine is going to generate a SQL query for me. And I can actually see the SQL query that's being generated in the background by right-clicking on this filtered rows step, go to View Native Query, and you can see that I've got a select statement with just those 4 columns selected in it, the 4 columns that I need. And I've got a where clause, where English day name of week is Friday, which is the filter that I've got there. So query folding really is just the way that the Power Query engine is going to try and push the hard work back to the data source. It only happens for some data sources. mostly relational databases, but also OData, as well as analysis services, Active Directory, Google Analytics, a couple of others. And it doesn't happen for data sources that don't really have anything like a database or a query language or anything where the hard work could be pushed back to. So for example, if you're getting data from a CSV file, there's no way that you could run a query against a CSV file because it's just a text file. So obviously query folding can't happen in that case. You will also find that different data sources have different levels of query folding supported, and not all transformations can be query folded in all cases. So for example, if we think about SQL, there are going to be some things that you can do in the Power Query editor in Power BI that either can't be turned into SQL yet by the Power Query engine because the developers haven't got around to doing that, and indeed may never be translatable into SQL simply because it's not possible to do the things that you want to be able to do in SQL. And again, those things, the things that can be folded back to the data source, will vary by data source. So for relational databases, typically you can fold a lot of things back to the data source. OData has a very rich query language, which means that you can fold things back to OData data sources quite often. But other types of data source may only have quite primitive query languages, so a lot of the things that you want to do in the Power Query editor might have to take place in the Power Query engine instead. Moving on, DirectQuery. DirectQuery is another thing that most, I think, Power BI users understand. It's a way that instead of copying data into Power BI, you can keep your data in the data source and get Power BI to generate a query against it every time a report is run, every time you click a slicer, and so on. So again, if you work in direct query mode against a SQL Server database, every time a report page is rendered, you'll see several SQL queries generated against the data source. And it's typically used for real-time reporting, and it's typically a bit slower than if you'd imported the data. Okay, so we've got all those things out of the way. I'm sure you knew most of them, but it's good to make sure we're all on the same page. Let's get back to talking about custom connectors. The real question with custom connectors is, why should you build them? Now, obviously they're cool and we all like writing code because writing code is fun, but there are actually a lot of different reasons why you might want to build custom connectors. And let me go through a few of them. First of all, and I think this is the main reason that people are considering building custom connectors, it's certainly the main reason that the customers that I work with want to build custom connectors, is to provide branded connectivity within Power BI. So let's imagine you are a company that has some kind of online service that you want people to be able to analyze data in. Let's say you have a specialist ERP system for people who make widgets for a living. You know how it is. Your customers contact you with requirements, and one day they come to you and they say, oh, we really want to be able to do some reporting on all of that interesting data that you keep in your ERP system. How can we get it out? So you think, oh, well, okay, the customers want BI and reporting. Let's just create a couple of pages. We'll build a couple of graphs and charts. We know roughly what people want to do, and then we'll say we've ticked the BI box. Yeah, we've all seen software vendors who do that, and generally speaking, the efforts are pretty half-hearted. They look terrible, and more importantly, generic reports never ever cut it. People have got their own requirements. They want to be able to build their own reports. So it turns out that implementing BI functionality on your data, on your software product, is going to be incredibly difficult and time consuming. So why even do it? Instead, what you can do is you can say, well, here's an API, here's some kind of connector. Why don't you get the data out, import it into your BI tool of choice, and then you can do whatever you want with it. Well, that's also doable, but as we've just heard, creating APIs that make it easy for the types of people who want to do BI to get data out without needing any code is pretty difficult. And what's more, if you're kind of trying to get away from the responsibility of BI, you don't want your customers to just see you as a data silo. They want to be able to understand that they're connecting to you and there's still some connection back. So with a custom connector, rather than just giving somebody a link to an API or a connection string to a database somewhere, you can provide a specific data source inside Power BI with your own branding on it. That means that your customers can see your icon, your logo inside Power BI and understand that they're connecting to your system. And again, if we have a look in Power BI Desktop under the new data source option, if we have a look at some of the custom connectors or the connectors that are in there, you can see that there is a whole bunch of different logos and data sources in there that immediately tell me what I'm connecting to. Now, a similar point related to that is that it's one thing to give people an API or a connection to a database. It's another thing to give them data that is in a suitable format for Power BI. So the other important thing to notice about custom connectors is that they provide access to data in a format, or they should provide access to data in a format that's easy to use and suitable for Power BI, perhaps something like a dimensional model. And this is certainly something that most APIs don't really do at the moment. Moving on from that, there are always going to be issues with connecting to especially web services. I've already talked about the whole topic of code-free support for connecting to and extracting data from web services. Also, what you'll find with custom connectors, and a reason to build custom connectors, is that you've got an API for a web service. Typically, the most complicated thing about connecting to that web service is authentication. And it's very common nowadays to have web services that use systems like OAuth 2 authentication, which can be really rather complex to do. Now, if you are a skilled M programmer in Power BI, you may be able to connect to and authenticate to these web services. But even then, there are some things, some types of web service that you literally cannot handle in Power BI Desktop alone, because they need more functionality than Power BI Desktop has actually got. So for example, if you do need to connect to a web service that uses OAuth 2 authentication, that is not really practical, not really supported in Power BI Desktop. However, custom connectors do have proper full support for OAuth 2 authentication and other variants of that. So building a custom connector will not only allow you to connect to a web service, but it'll be able to support more complex authentication mechanisms than regular Power BI can. Now, after you've connected to your web service or your data source, you then also need to think about getting good performance of getting the data out. And as we've just seen, query folding on a data source is going to be very, very important to get good performance. So it turns out that inside your custom connector, one of the things that you can do is add specific support for query folding. You can say, for example, that when a user does a filter on a table in the Power BI, the Power Query editor, that filter can be translated through and passed back to your data source, whether it's a web service or a database, and get that better performance. So you can get some really significant performance improvements for doing this. On a related note, it's kind of the same mechanism supporting query folding supporting DirectQuery in a data source. So with some extra development effort, you can also support DirectQuery inside data sources if you implement it inside a custom connector. And then the last thing that you'll find is that if you've ever played around with Advanced M, you may well have seen the infamous formula firewall error, which is a result of the data privacy checks that Power BI does. These are data privacy checks that stop data being sent from one data source to another. They are necessary. Microsoft does not want you to lose your job from playing around in Power BI, but they can be very, very difficult to understand, and when you get these errors, they can be very difficult to get away from. So in some cases, you will find you'll be tearing your hair out, and you'll find that you can't actually get around these formula firewall errors if you're writing M in Power BI Desktop. You will find that because data privacy checks are not applied in a custom connector, you can do exactly the same thing and avoid the data privacy checks and the formula firewall error there. So a wide variety of reasons to build custom connectors. Right now, custom connectors are fully supported in Power BI Desktop, and they are on the verge of being properly fully supported after you've published your reports up to the Power BI service. They are in fact officially supported if you're refreshing through the on-premises gateway in personal mode, but of course not many people are actually using the on-premises gateway in personal mode in an enterprise environment. You'll want the what used to be called the enterprise gateway but is now just called the on-premises gateway. Support for custom connectors is still in preview for that, but I would expect that to come out of preview very, very soon. So we're on the verge of being able to properly use custom connectors in production. When that happens, we are promised a whole load of other things as well. For example, if you've ever used custom visuals in Power BI, you'll know that you can go to App Source and get custom visuals from there. There will be a similar marketplace for Power BI custom connectors by the Office Store. So you'll be able, you can imagine that inside that Get Data dialog, I guess you'll be able to click a button, go to the Office Store, browse a wide variety of custom connectors, bring them into Power BI, and extend it that way. And of course, we would expect that these custom connectors to work not just in Power BI, but in all of the places that Power Queries are used, including Excel, Analysis Services Tabular, and I guess the new data flows functionality we've been hearing so much about. We've also been told that custom connectors will be able to act as function libraries. There are already a lot of people, me included, but lots of other people like Imke Feldman, for example, who are blogging and sharing loads and loads of really interesting M functions for people to use. And it would be really good to have a way of distributing those functions so that every time you open up Power BI Desktop, you've got them there available to use. And that's what custom connectors are going to be able to do as well. So rather than allowing you to connect to different types of data source, they'll just provide various different useful M functions. And finally, something that we'll get in the future is proper versioning and cryptographic signatures as well. Something else that's being talked about are certified connectors. So there is going to be, or there is already, a certification process for custom connectors that are not built by Microsoft, but which are going to be distributed by Microsoft, I guess, through the store that I just talked about. The certification process is going to involve people checking your code to make sure that it meets certain standards, to make sure that you're not gathering people's credentials and sending them over the web back to some shady website. And you'll find that once you've met those requirements, once you've gone through the certification process, you will find that your custom connectors get a special blue tick next to them, which means that people will be more confident in using them. Also, something that's happened in recent builds of Power BI Desktop is that when custom connectors came out of preview in Power BI Desktop, a switch appeared that meant that you were only allowed to use certified connectors by default. So if you're thinking about using custom connectors and developing your own custom connectors, what you have to do in Power BI Desktop is, if we go to the options dialog, so I go to File, Options and Settings, Options, and go to Security, the default is this only allowed certified extensions to load. I've got this set to not recommended, allow any extension to load without validation or warning. That's going to be the only option that you're going to be able to use if you want to build your own custom connectors and not go through the certification process. Okay, it's time to build a custom connector. Now, like I said, if you want to build a custom connector, you've got to download and install the Power Query SDK, which you can do from the Visual Studio Marketplace. It is updated on a regular basis. The last update was at the end of August, and it gets new features as they're added to Power BI Desktop, and it also gets new features that are not available in Power BI Desktop. And sometimes it's a little bit of a game to guess what these new features are. I've got this installed. I've got Visual Studio, it's 2015 here. I have got 2017 installed, but I've got 2015 here. If I want to build a new custom connector, I can just go to File, New Project. I've got my Power Query template here. I can click to create a new data connector project. I can also create a PQ file here if I want to just play around with running M queries. I can do from a .pq file here. If I create a new data connector project, let's give it a name, click OK. Some magic will happen. We look at this RDUPUG PQ file here. And in fact, I've already got a usable custom connector. Now, I'm going to build this, and I've got a Visual Studio add-in here installed called Auto Deploy. Now, after I've built this, this will have created a .mes file in my project folder. I need to, in order to be able to use this in Power BI Desktop, click and move this over to a particular folder. So here it's the Documents folder, Power BI Desktop Custom Connectors. Any mes file in here is going to be available as a custom connector. So if I copy this, go to Visual Studio, and I say, let's click and copy my mes file. We'll put it into there, click OK. If I do a build again, I should see my new .mes file there. And I don't even need to restart Power BI Desktop. I can go to Power BI Desktop, I can go to New Source, More, go down to here, there's my RDUPUG custom connector, click Connect, tells me it's a preview connector, click Continue. I need to provide some information about authentication, but I'm just going to use anonymous authentication because it doesn't actually connect to anywhere. And there's my custom connector returning a bit of text. So that's, in a nutshell, how you can get started with custom connectors. What are the things that a custom connector should contain? Well, a couple of different things. You're going to need to have some M functions that connect to the data source and get the data out. You're also, as I said, not just going to want to provide your users with raw data. You're going to need to transform that data into tables that are friendly and usable for Power BI. So a lot of the contents of a custom connector, a lot of the code you write are going to be for doing these two things. You're also going to need to tell Power BI what kind of authentication this data source needs. It also needs something called a navigation table, and that's just one of those things. For example, here if I connect to my local SQL Server instance again, this is a navigation table where you'll see, in this case, my SQL Server instance and all of the databases and all of the views and tables on that. So you'll probably want to be able to provide something like that yourself for your Power BI users. You'll also want to provide branding, so you'll need to have some icons with your corporate logo in, and a few other things here, for example, support for query folding. So let's talk a little bit more about this. First of all, in terms of the code you need to connect to your data sources. This is, like I said, where you're going to spend the vast majority of your time, because this is the most complicated thing to do. Now, the recommendation from Microsoft is that if you're building a custom connector, the ideal data sources to use are OData data sources if you've got a web service, or ODBC data sources if you've got a relational data source. Other data sources, unfortunately, like file-based data sources, are not supported, so these are really your two options: web services and database type data sources. Now, the reason is that if you use OData and use an ODBC connector, Power BI has already got lots of great support for these types of data sources. So it makes it a lot easier for you to be able to build your custom connector if you build on top of OData or ODBC. For example, they already have implicit support for query folding, so you don't need to implement that. And also, for example, if you connect to an OData data source, it will automatically generate a navigation table for you, so you don't even need to do that either. As a result, it makes so much so easy that the recommendation again from Microsoft is that if you're not working on top of OData or ODBC, it might be easier and better to build an OData data source for your an OData provider for your web service, or an ODBC provider for your relational database if you haven't got one already, and then build a custom connector on top of that, rather than try and do all of the hard work inside Power BI. Now, to give you an idea of some of this, what I've got is a pre-built custom connector that I've got here. This is a custom connector that comes from an OData data source. This is a real public OData data source from the Houses of Parliament, so the UK government. So the Houses of Parliament here in the UK have got a web service that provides lots and lots of useful information about things that go on inside government. And here I can get the service root URL, which tells me something about all of the options that we've got. Now, this is an OData data source, and as I said, you might be thinking, well, if I've already got an OData data source, why do I need a custom connector? But this is a good example of why a custom connector is useful. If I go to new source OData feed, and I paste in the service root URL for the UK Parliament OData data source, and I click OK, we'll get a navigator window in here, but then we'll see a lot of things which sometimes work, but sometimes don't. So what we will see somewhere is a lot of data that is empty. I'll start to see some errors in a couple of places, or at least sometimes I'll see some errors. And there is a lot of a lot of stuff here that's never ever going to be useful at all. Even if I do find something that is useful, so this party entity will give me a list of political parties that are that have stood for Parliament, stood for government. So if I click OK here and load this in, we'll see, for example, a whole series of error values. And then we've got all this mysterious, these navigation links to link over to the party membership, the party candidacy tables. So there's, it's not really friendly to use from a Power BI point of view. You'll also see, if you look at this, some of the weird and wonderful political parties. There's somebody standing for the Ubuntu party, and yes, some of the kind of less nice and salubrious parties that we've got in the UK as well. But yeah, this is literally just every party that stood for Parliament, and they could be all kinds of weird wackos here. All right. What are the kind of things that we'll be doing inside our custom connector? Some of the things we might need to support. We need to support authentication. So if I go to my UK Parliament custom connector, what are the things that we can do in here? Well, what we need to do is we need to declare what type of authentication it uses. So in this case, there's no authentication needed. I'm going to use just anonymous. But if we go back to our Raleigh Durham user group custom connector, you can see that I've actually got a whole series of different possibilities here that are commented out. I can set it up to use API keys. I can do basic authentications with usernames and passwords. I can do Windows authentication here. I can also handle more exotic type things, not just OAuth 2, but all of the different variations on top of that. One of the things that I've learned about OAuth 2 since I've been writing custom connectors is that nobody's implementation of OAuth 2 is the same as anybody else's. So you've got a lot of flexibility there. And all of the credentials that you pass in are going to be stored in Power Query's own secure credentials store. In terms of providing user-friendly access to the data, you will find that when you're developing, after you've successfully connected to a data source, you'll create a connector, load in some raw data into Power BI desktop, and then you can use the Power Query UI to manipulate that data, create a query to get that data into the format that you want, and then you can copy and paste the code back into your custom connector so that everybody can benefit from it. So for example here, if I have a look at the OData data source that I was looking at, we've decided that yes, there's going to be an awful lot of stuff in here that is probably not very useful and maybe not very friendly. In my UK Parliament connector, I've got some information here where I rename columns, and for example here with other tables that I'm connected to, I am removing columns, renaming columns, extracting data, adding extra columns, and so on. We can also add some diagnostics into our custom connector. So for example, you might want to check what's going on when you're connecting to a data source. There are some tools that you can use to do this outside your custom connector. You can use, for example, Fiddler to see what's happening when you connect back to a web service, or if you're connecting back to a relational database like SQL Server, you might have Profiler or the equivalent of Profiler or extended events on those other platforms to see the queries that are being generated. But in some cases, it's really handy to know and have some diagnostic information from inside your custom connector. So there are some special M functions that are intended for use inside custom connectors. For example, the diagnostics.trace function that will allow you to log to the Power Query engine's own log files to be able to find out what's going on. And if we have a look inside my UK Parliament example, I've got some code here where I've got an example of using diagnostics.trace. So if I connect to the Parliament OData feed and it's not available, I can log a message to say the API is not available in my log file. Navigation tables, like I said, allow you to not only expose the tables that you want people to connect to, but also expose the queries that give them that user-friendly data. So we've already said that instead of just giving people raw data, you want to give them pre-prepared data. You can then expose this list of tables that give people pre-prepared data through navigation tables. If we have a look at my UK Parliament OData, my UK Parliament connector here, I've got a navigation table, and this just uses the #table function to expose just a list of the 3 tables that I want people to have access to. Now this is just a simple table. There is a commonly used function called table.toNavigation table that you can copy and paste from the GitHub repo that I showed you a bit earlier. This adds all of the extra metadata that's needed to tell Power BI Desktop that the table you're looking at is actually genuinely a navigation table. We have a look inside Power BI Desktop and I connect to my custom connector. And I scroll down, connect to my UK Parliament custom connector here. There you can see that I've got a nice, clean, friendly navigation table. If I click on my party here, I only see the columns that I want people to see on that party table. So it's already a lot more user-friendly going through the custom connector than it would be going through an OData feed. You can also add documentation to your functions. Those of you who've done a bit of coding in M will know that you can see documentation for any M function inside Power BI Desktop, inside the Power Query editor. So for example here, if I create a new blank query and ask for shared. Here, this gives me a list of all of the M functions that are either in the built-in function library or exposed through custom connectors. And then here, if I click on a function, the new table.fuzzyNestedJoin function that's been added this month, you can see a whole load of useful documentation telling you what all of the different parameters are and giving you some examples of usage. So this is obviously something that you want to be able to expose as well. And if we scroll right to the bottom here, now usually I can find this pretty quickly, but maybe it would be better if I converted this into a table and sorted it in descending order. You can see here I've got one of the functions that I've exposed through my custom connector, get party members, and I can see documentation available here. If we have a look back in Visual Studio, you can see how documentation is added. It's added through creating a custom type and adding metadata to that custom type. So this is the meta function that allows you to add a record with various different metadata onto it. You create a custom type, and then here you can use value.replace type to say for the get party members implementation, which normally just returns a table, it's going to return a table of a specific custom type with this documentation applied to it. You can also make sure that your custom connector creates relationships between tables when the tables are loaded into Power BI. So not just the tables itself, but also specify when relationships are created. If I go back into here, I'm going to set this going because this can sometimes take a little bit of a long time. I go back to my OData feed, my UK Parliament custom connector here, and click Connect. I'm exposing 3 tables: party, which is a political party; party member, these are people who sit in Parliament who are members of a political party; and then this party membership table is a bridge table which links parties to party members. And there are several cases of people who change their parties and so on. If I click OK, there are my 3 tables. If I click Close and Apply and load this data into Power BI, what we will find is that when these tables are loaded in, I not only get the tables, but I should also get the relationship set up between these tables. Now, to a certain extent, this will happen automatically by Power BI looking at the names of my columns and the data types, but I can actually specify for relationships to be created between tables by actually writing some M code using the table.nestedJoin function. You do a merge, which is kind of like a SQL join between 2 tables, and then you just delete it again. So you do it as a step and then have another subsequent step that deletes the column that's created by the merge, and that's enough to add a bit of metadata onto the table to tell Power BI, after those tables have been loaded in, to create a relationship between them. And this is again one of those extra things that you can do to make things a lot more user-friendly for your end users. So they not only get the tables in a nice clean format, but when they load them into Power BI Desktop, all of the right relationships are created. And I don't know about you, but whenever I see other people's Power BI Desktop files, perhaps one of the biggest problems I have is people who don't necessarily understand their data enough to know where relationships should be built and end up with relationships they don't actually want, which cause them problems. If we have a look inside here, we've got an internal server error, so that demo is not going to work. What I should see here are my 3 tables. All right, that brings me to the end of my presentation. Thank you for listening. I hope you found this interesting. And I hope you are all still there. Seeing that internal server error has made me wonder where the internet's gone down. I've been speaking to nobody for the last half an hour. But
not at all, Chris. I've been listening along quite well. The communication, the audio was clear throughout.
Good.
If you don't mind, do you have a moment for a question, at least from me?
Absolutely, yes.
Okay, so I'm intrigued by that last thing that you showed there with creating the relationships. And you mentioned, of course, the automatic relationships that can be created simply by Power BI recognizing 2 tables that have perhaps the same column name, and they meet the qualifications of at least one of those 2 tables where those values are distinct. Mm-hmm. That's nice when it happens, right? But yeah, the method that you showed with the nested join, I'm curious about that. In the event that you attempt to make that join, and then Power BI says, well, that join wouldn't be allowed for a connection because maybe at development time, one of those tables was unique, but now I have duplicate rows, and a relationship would not be valid at the latest refresh. Can you talk to me about how that would be impacted? Would you get an error? Would it remove a relationship that was there and no longer be there? What would happen?
I guess it would probably really just work like relationships that you've already created. So, you know, if at design time you'd already manually created a relationship and then you did a refresh and a column that was distinct was no longer distinct, you get an error and refresh would be cancelled. So I guess the same thing would happen with one of these automatically generated relationships.
Okay, that was
so. Just to show you some of the code here, what I'm doing. If you remember, I've got a party table and I've got a party member table, and there's this party membership bridge table. What I'm doing here is I'm doing a table not nested join between the party membership and the party member table, doing the same thing here with a party table. And then after I've done that, I'm just removing the two columns that are created by these two steps. So it doesn't look like anything's happened. It just is enough to add the mysterious metadata to get those relationships created. But that's literally just going to happen the first time you load the data in.
Okay, very good. So it doesn't actually, so it would come through as a load error then, probably not as something that would trip up the M query or cause your connector to have a problem.
Absolutely, yes.
So, okay, that's fantastic. I am always intrigued to learn those new features or new tricks to get the Power Queries to do things that you wouldn't necessarily think is possible. The one thing that I noticed there, you mentioned, and I've heard something similar about the OAuth 2 method of connectivity, or as of authentication. Have you had specific issues there or problems as far as getting that hooked up for some of your customers with OAuth? Any special use cases that have produced any interesting code?
Yes, so this is, I think, as I said, this is always the most difficult part, simply because when somebody says, oh yeah, we do OAuth 2 authentication, there are just so many different variations on how it needs to work that it is, you have to go through the documentation. There's no way that, well, I put it another way, I think the reason why the Power Query dev team weren't able to do OAuth 2 authentication out of the box is because there is just such a lot of diversity in how it's actually implemented. And what I found with my customers, and it's a shame actually, I can't show off some of the code that I've written for some of my customers. There are just so many different details in the authentication, different headers you need to pass in. I mean, in theory, you should be able to, you should have to kind of pop open a web browser window and log in interactively. But that doesn't happen in some cases with people who support OAuth 2. So that's when you've really got to read your customer's documentation, understand what's going on, and handle things in your own code. And one of the good things actually about writing M code in custom connectors is that you not only get all of this extra built-in stuff to handle things like OAuth 2 authentication, you can also write code that actually gets the authentication information, finds out the username and the password, and does stuff with it, passes it in different ways, and so on. So, for example, there is a facility in Power BI Desktop to store an API key. Mm-hmm. So there's that key-based authentication, and when you use that, that gets passed through inside the URL in the query string. Sure. Now, some web services actually want that key passed through as a header, not as a query parameter. And you can certainly do that in Power BI Desktop, but then that means you can't actually store the API key in the secure credentials store, whereas you can absolutely do that inside a custom connector. You can get people to type in an API key, and then when you authenticate, you can say, well, let's override the way things work. Don't try and pass the authentication through the URL, but pass it through this header instead.
Okay. So that's some of the capabilities that you just wouldn't be able to facilitate in a standard OData connection, the out-of-the-box connector that we have.
Absolutely, yes.
That's fantastic.
Or using web.contents to connect to any web service, yeah.
Great. So I don't mean to hog all the question time with Chris, so I'd definitely like to open this up if anyone else would like to open their mic or type in a question. We can certainly do that.
Let's see whether
I'm monitoring the conversation there, so we haven't had any new questions come in since the beginning. It looks like Robert's typing something now, so we'll give him a moment to finish that thought. Maybe not. While he's typing that up, Chris, I'm curious on the work that you are doing right now. Do you do exclusively OData sources, or have you worked against some of the other more open API formats that are found?
a bit of both. So some OData and some kind of just generic web services that I get at through just using the web.contents function in M. And I would imagine that because OData is only really popular in the Microsoft world for people who are not only using Microsoft services but building web services in .NET. Most of the web services out there don't use OData, so you've got to use web.contents to be able to access them.
Yeah, that's the ones that I've created just sort of on my own to see how all this works. I haven't found any OData sources that sort of intrigue me. I mean, I've watched them. I've worked with a couple of them, and I've had a couple of the folks that I work with want to consume them, and it is so much more a convenient place to start when you have all of those pieces in place up front. The authentication method, basically the data model is given to you, versus having to go in and discover all of that stuff for yourself.
Yeah, absolutely.
So those JSON requests and the pagination that you have to be able to manage in those open sources, and the different ways in which they manage pagination. So you can't just use one function from one connector to the next. It feels like every time you've got to rewrite that in a custom twist. So
yeah,
I like what you showed there, though, because I initially, when I first came at it, I thought of OData sources as sort of, well, do they really need that much tweaking at the end? And really, you showed a perfect example there where, yeah, just because it's OData and it's easy to connect to doesn't mean that it's already been cleaned up and prepped for showtime, so to speak. When it's time to write a report, you want to do more.
Well, let's face it, when was the last time you met a developer who really understood data modeling?
No, I don't. I haven't met one yet. But you're right. It's not so much a guilty thing on their part for having not created the model. There's lots of different ways to use it.
Yeah,
so even
absolutely.
if everything had perfect metadata and only the columns I needed, maybe for my reporting needs I need a different format, or I want to complement it with my own custom column or something.
Exactly. I mean, the things that you need for Power BI can sometimes be very, very specialist and very, from one user to another. So you're right. There's, most of the time people build an API for a lot of reasons that don't include doing any kind of BI or reporting on top of that.
Well, a lot of those APIs don't just start with GET; they come with posts. So you can actually, some of those APIs are for writing data back, which is, of course, something that we don't do in the Power BI world, but sometimes it's for third-party application development. So they're doing it for a lot of reasons.
Absolutely.
So we got a couple.
I was going to say, this is Josiah, and just to apologize for kind of my audio troubles at the beginning there. But thank you for that, Chris. That was super enlightening. To kind of echo what Wes was just saying about being able to do some of those transformations This is very timely because I actually have a project that my firm has just won, and the intent has been to expose a lot of things via API, but this definitely opened my eyes to some other possibilities for the component that's going to have Power BI as an endpoint. So really, really helpful to just kind of introduce me to some things I hadn't thought about yet.
Yeah. Well, you need to think about building a custom connector for it.
I think we may take a look at that in a couple places.
I know a guy who can help you out with that, Josiah.
I've heard he's really good.
Yeah. Cool. Well, I don't see any other questions coming through in our conversation link. A couple folks saying thanks for the presentation. With that, then, I think we'll probably just wrap up the recording at this point. Wanted to say, on behalf of Josiah and I, thanks for everyone who joined tonight's call. Thank you, especially Chris, for your presentation. It was very insightful. Please be sure to join us back through the Meetup link for our upcoming meetings, and have a good rest of your evening.
Yeah, it was a pleasure. It's the next morning for me. It's midnight, so I'm going to go to bed.
All right. Well, we appreciate you staying up for us. Thanks.
It's my pleasure. It's no problem at all.
All right.
And before the rest of the crew drops, I'll just say one last thing.